Do you have a glass of water?
I do have a couple.
Great.
Sure, we
Is
do.
that a copy of your
Statement.
It is fantastic.
Yes.
I probably won't need to take you to it.
Okay.
And is it still senior sergeant?
Yes, so it's acting senior sergeant, but it's neither here nor there. So senior sergeant.
All stand. Coronial Court now stand to Zoom. Please be seated.
There's a matter I'll discuss once we have concluded with this witness, but for the time being, for Acting Senior Sergeant Alastair Gore.
Acting Senior Sergeant, thanks for coming to court today. Do you promise to tell the truth to the court?
Yes, I do, Your Honour.
Thank you.
Senior Sergeant, can I ask you to restate your name for the record?
Yes, Alastair Gould, Senior Sergeant, Alice Springs Police Station.
And I asked you the question just before we commenced, but your current rank is?
It is Acting Senior Sergeant.
And what's your substantive rank?
Sergeant.
I take it that you'd been in the Alice Springs Command for about 3 years in 2019, is that right?
Correct.
And had you been in Alice Springs for some time longer?
So I arrived in Alice Springs from Darwin in January 2017, and I've been here since then.
Where had you been previously?
Prior to that, I was in Darwin.
And what was your rank and station in Darwin?
In Darwin, I was a sergeant at Casuarina Police Station. Prior to that, I was in the Darwin Watch House, also as a sergeant.
What I want to do, if I might, Senior Sergeant, is ask you some general questions about the role of a sergeant and a senior sergeant in a busy station like Casuarina or Alice Springs. Mm-hmm. I'll then ask you some questions about the 9th of November 2019, and then finally some questions about some use of force incidents that I think you were involved in auditing. Just starting with the first of those topics, what role does a senior sergeant or watch commander play in the overall management and supervision of a police station like Alice Springs?
So a watch commander is primarily in Alice Springs is attached to a patrol group, and the patrol group would comprise of the general duties members that operate out in the community in Alice Springs. There is also a sergeant attached to that patrol group, as well as the general duties response. A watch commander also has oversight of other assets within the organisation. For example, we have our point of sale police officers that's down at the bottle shops. We have foot patrol units that operate in town. We have Southern Traffic that operate here in Alice Springs. Now, as well as being responsible and having an oversight of events within Alice Springs, we also have an oversight of the Southern Desert region as a whole. So part of that role would be liaising with staff in our bush stations. And essentially, the shift sergeant would generally run the patrol group. You have the station sergeants that run their stations. I would have oversight of their responsibilities and also be a conduit to the executives or the senior management.
In terms of the work that you do supervising an individual patrol group in Alice Springs. Do I take it from your last answer that most of the time you would be rostered on with the same patrol group?
That's correct.
Okay. And most of the time, that patrol group would be rostered on with the same shift sergeant, is that right?
Correct.
So as best you can, you try to ensure that a group of constables and potentially senior constables are overseen by the same sergeant and senior sergeant each time they come to work.
Yes, of course, for the purposes of being in a team and for continuity and to get to know your staff, yes.
Now, Her Honour's already heard evidence from quite a number of police officers, junior police officers, very senior police officers, about the importance of supervision to junior police officers like constables working the beat in Alice Springs. Has that been your experience, that supervising junior police officers as a sergeant and senior sergeant is important?
Yes, absolutely.
Why is it important?
So in Alice Springs, I would say it's not more important. However, there's probably more of a focus on the supervision of constables in Alice Springs from a watch commander and perhaps from a shift sergeant. The main reason being that many of our staff, in fact most of our staff, historically have been very junior. So the members on the ground, the members attached to the patrol groups, at the moment they have very little experience, so they're not able to gain the experience or the mentoring or leadership guidance from senior constables that they may be partnered with or they may be part of their team. So that would fall down to, or that responsibility would then come to the shift sergeant.
Another witness who's given evidence, Senior Sergeant Sean Finesse, also arrived in Alice Springs, I think, in around about 2017, and gave evidence that he was surprised by how junior the Alice Springs workforce was compared to the Darwin workforce. Is that a sentiment you'd agree with?
Absolutely, yes, Your Honour.
And you'd agree that in the absence of those more senior general duties officers like senior constables, that increases the need for supervision from the sergeants and watch commanders?
Yes, correct.
You may not be able to comment on this, but there's also been some evidence from a number of police officers who were constables in the 1990s that since that time the workforce has become more junior in Alice Springs. Is that something you have any knowledge of?
Look, I've heard those comments as well, perhaps from the same people. However, I would not have any first-hand experience of that.
Now, one of the other pieces of information we've received only this morning from Superintendent Nobbs was that also, over time, the administrative burden on sergeants and senior sergeants is increasing.
Yes, I would agree with that.
Could you explain to Her Honour what's meant when you talk about the administrative burden?
Yes, so in an ideal world, Your Honour, the shift sergeant, the supervisor there, would like to spend a healthy percentage of the shift out on the road, assisting constables, attending jobs, mentoring the constables, administering a quality control, if you like. However, much of our work now is office-based, so the opportunities to get out on the road are limited, or are certainly reduced compared to what they were several years ago.
Is that something that you're aware of, as an issue that's being tackled at an institutional level? This issue that at the same time that the workforce is getting more junior and you'd think more in need of supervision, there's less capacity amongst the senior officers to actually provide that supervision?
Look, I would agree that there is a lot of competing interests, a lot of demands on the supervisors, the shift sergeants primarily. As an organisation, we are trying to get back to, we call it back to basics, and bring it back to our core role as a police service, Your Honour. However, we do seem to be burdened with other tasks that link in with other organisations, that link in with other service providers, whereby we have considerable input, and that often takes us away from our core duties, and certainly takes us away from the management of our members.
One of the oversight or supervision tasks of a watch commander in the southern region is attending its CMT meetings. Is that correct?
Sorry, what did you say, watch commander?
The senior sergeant, would the senior sergeant ordinarily attend at CMT meetings?
No. So the only meeting that a watch commander would ordinarily attend would be the Monday morning TCG meetings.
Okay. And what is the TCG meeting?
So it's a meeting that's held on a Monday morning by the head of each group within the police station. So, for example, you would expect to find the OIC of the police station, the superintendent of the police station, somebody from Intel, somebody from community policing, somebody who's responsible for the point of sales service. Also, Tennant Creek would have the OIC from Tennant Creek, the superintendent from Tennant Creek would be involved as well. So essentially, it's I understand it to be the previous week's issues, matters are discussed, and any goals for the following week.
When you say matters, are these active policing matters, or would they also include matters like the need to address problem behaviours or supervise individual officers? So
I haven't been at a TCG meeting where the issue of discipline or, so you'll have to comment in terms of supervising members. I haven't been at a TCG meeting where that has been involved. Most of the meetings are in relation to crime trends, significant events that may be happening within the division, events, incidents, the deployment of resources, statistics, etc.
If complaints were being made about officers within a patrol group over which you were the senior sergeant, how, if at all, would they be communicated to you?
Sometimes not at all. On other occasions, it may be the OIC of the station or the superintendent of the police station. So it may be verbally, it may be via email, it may be via PSC in Darwin. There's a number of different ways.
But I take it that there isn't some formal process according to which you as a senior sergeant ensure that, you know, once a week, once a fortnight or once a month, you're up to date on all of the disciplinary matters pending for the officers under your command.
That's correct. Yes.
Correct in the sense that there isn't any formal process.
There is no formal process that I'm aware of, Your Honour.
I want to ask you some questions briefly about November 2019. I won't linger on this subject for very long. At around 7:35 p.m, you received a call from Superintendent Nobbs, is that correct?
Yes, I did.
I'm going to pass over the events earlier in the day. And you were told that Kumanjayi Walker had passed away.
Yes. To
the best of your memory, what did he tell you?
It was a very brief conversation, Your Honour. Mr. Nobbs asked me to or source a number of police officers and facilitate them boarding a plane and sending them to Yuendamu. So that was the gist of the conversation. And yes, he advised me that Kumanjayi Walker had passed away.
You mentioned that he asked you to send some members to Yuendamu. How did you identify those members?
So we have rosters. Essentially, I look at the roster. I saw what patrol groups were off duty. I saw what other units within the station were off duty, and I used our text messenger system to send text messages to those relevant officers to request that they attend the police station.
Now, one of those officers was Sergeant Terry Zhang, is that correct?
That's correct, Your Honour.
And do you identify Terry Zhang at that point as the officer who was to serve as forward commander?
No. When I sent the text messages, I didn't have the intention of I didn't have the intention of sourcing a forward commander. Essentially, it's a case of send a text message out, see who you get, see who attends, and then whoever attends, Your Honour, that assessment is then made with whoever attends for the overtime, which would be based on the seniority of that member.
So just to clarify, you sent out the text message, you got effectively an expression of interest back, and at that point in time you selected from those officers the officer who was to be the forward commander, is that right?
The forward commander was selected. I don't recall having any involvement in that myself. However, yes, that is how it happened. So Terry Zhang was selected as the forward commander.
Okay. Was that communicated to you at any point in time?
I don't remember, sorry.
There's been some evidence from Senior Sergeant Mitchell King that he was surprised that Sergeant Zhang was selected as forward commander. In fairness, he was very careful to say that he didn't want to be critical of Sergeant Zhang, but felt that probably an officer of superintendent level or higher was justified given the seriousness of what had occurred. Perhaps you've already answered this, but do you have any comment on that? Can you recall any of the decision making around identifying Sergeant Zhang as the forward commander?
I can't, sorry, Your Honour, no recollection of that. I generally, when Mr. Nobbs attended the police station to take control of the incident, he operated in an office next door to my office. So essentially, Mr. Nobbs took control of the incident at Yuendamu. I remained in control of the other matters affecting the rest of the Southern Desert region and also Alice Springs.
The next conversation I wanted to ask you about was a conversation that you had with Sergeant Julie Frost. Can you recall?
Yes, I briefly recall that conversation.
Now, at page 6 of your recorded statement, you give an account of that conversation, and you say that Sergeant Frost described the situation in Yuendamu as volatile. Can you recall that?
Yes, I can, Your Honour.
Can you explain to Her Honour what Sergeant Frost said?
Look, my recollection of the exact conversation is almost non-existent, Your Honour, unfortunately. She recalled to me, or she expressed to me that the situation was volatile, the situation was dangerous. I believe at one stage she expressed an interest that the matter of evacuating the police members from Yuendamu was being considered.
Did you have any further conversations with her or Superintendent Nobbs about evacuation?
No.
Any further conversations about level of risk on the ground?
None whatsoever, Your Honour.
And did she explain what she meant by dangerous? What was it that she thought was dangerous?
She didn't explain to me what was dangerous. However, because of my position and my experience and my brief knowledge of events or what can happen in a community on occasions such as this, I pretty much knew what she was talking about. So by that I mean it was possible that there was unrest in the community that posed a potential danger to the members within the police station.
And was that based on your experience in Yuendamu or other Indigenous communities or in urban areas of the territory?
So it's historically, to my knowledge, Yuendamu can often be a volatile community, and unfortunately continues to be. I have worked at a remote station previously, many years ago, and I am aware that certain decisions around people getting arrested can have an impact on the residents, and that on occasions that can cause unrest.
What was the remote station?
That was Ramaginning in Arnhem Land, Your Honour.
That's a Yolnu.
Yes, correct.
I won't ask you any more questions about that, but I want to ask you some questions now about some of the use of force incidents that you audited as sergeant or shift sergeant. Before I do, I just want to put this to you. The statistics that have been gathered and analysed by Commander Proctor suggested of the 46 use of force incidents that that Constable Rolfe was involved in over the 3-year period that he was a police constable, you were senior sergeant for 41% of those.
Look, I can only take your word for that, Your Honour. It sounds about right, but I don't know the statistics myself.
And if I put it to you that you were the sergeant for approximately 11% of those use of force incidents, would that sound about right?
It sounds about right, yes.
If that's correct, you were on duty for over half of the entirety of Constable Rolfe's use of force incidents.
I accept that.
And would that be a fair reflection of the amount of time you spent rostered on with Constable Rolfe? When he was a part of Patrol Group 5, you tended either to be sergeant or senior sergeant.
Yes, that would be a true reflection. Yes.
Would it surprise you to learn that if those statistics are correct, you were on duty more than any other senior officer while Constable Rolfe used force?
Yes, I would accept that.
The first matter I wanted to ask you about was a matter that occurred on the 1st of April 2017. Beck, we can have Doc 1. This was an incident that occurred outside Bojangles. I'm not sure if you recall it. The use of force case note entry, which I've just put up on the screen. Can you see that in front of you on the computer, Senior Sergeant?
Yes, I can.
Perhaps if we scroll down just a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'll paraphrase, but a narrative of the incident is there provided. And in effect, Member Rolfe and McCormack, Senior Constable McCormack, attended Bojangles in response to a fight outside the street. They identified one of the males and placed him in the cage. The other male, however, was disorderly and argumentative, and then ran from the area and was chased by Constable Rolfe. Constable Rolfe then tackled him to the ground, and I believe that the individual might have suffered minor grazes, but no more significant injury. Can you recall auditing this case note entry?
No, I can't, Your Honour.
Perhaps if we could go down a little bit further. The next page, please. It's the third page. Right to the bottom. All right, can we stop there? You'll see a couple of inches below the top of the page, there's a bold heading, Supervisor Details Member,
Yes, that's me.
and the name is Alastair Gore.
Correct.
That suggests that you audited this case note entry.
Yes, it does.
Underneath that heading, there's another heading that reads Supervisor Details Comments, and those comments are the comments that you typed into the promise case note entry while you audited the job. Is that right?
That is correct, Your Honour.
Now, are you aware that this is one of the use of force incidents that Detective Senior Sergeant Barham reviewed for the purpose of giving a statement in these proceedings?
No, I'm not, Your Honour.
So you weren't aware that his opinion was that the force that had been applied to this individual was not reasonable, necessary, proportionate or appropriate?
I wasn't aware of that, Your Honour.
And that he suggested that because the offender had only been given an infringement notice for fighting in a public place, a better response would have been not to pursue in the circumstances. I take it that the answer is you weren't aware that that was his opinion.
That's correct, I didn't know that.
I want to ask you some questions about your opinion in a moment, but in fairness, I also want to put to you the opinion of Assistant Commissioner Porter also reviewed this incident for the purpose of giving an affidavit and indicated that it was not possible to determine whether the force was reasonable, necessary, proportionate and appropriate, owing to a lack of information.
Okay.
But agreed with Detective Senior Sergeant Barham that the choice to pursue led to force being used when it could have been avoided. I don't want you to venture into the debate about whether or not the force that was used on this occasion was reasonable or excessive. But can I ask you to reflect on the comments of Detective Senior Sergeant Barham and Assistant Commissioner Porter that the choice to pursue led to the application of force when it could have been avoided?
Yes, Your Honour, I acknowledge that it was a low-level offence, and if the offender hadn't been pursued, then there would have been no application of force.
In other words, whether or not it was a lawful application of force, this was a matter that might have warranted some guidance to Constable Rolfe about exercising discretion and making different choices in the context of using force. Would you agree?
Yes, I would accept that, Your Honour.
Constable Rolfe had been an active police officer for about 5 months at that time.
Okay.
Wasn't it critical, given the reliance on more senior officers for guidance, that someone take Constable Rolfe aside and say, look, while what you did was probably lawful, you had a choice here, and a different and potentially safer choice might have been to let this man run away?
Yes, I accept that.
Now, one of the other things I want to ask you about that document, I'm sorry, Beck. Is the final line. It reads, body worn was but activated in time before the male fled police. Now, perhaps I'll let you interpret that before I do.
Yeah, so it's clearly a typo on my behalf. I believe that should say body worn was activated but not in time before the male fled police. So I think the gist of what I'm saying there is that it probably was not activated at the start of the incident.
And that would explain why, for example, Assistant Commissioner Porter ultimately found that he couldn't substantiate this allegation that excessive force had been used. There was no objective record of what had occurred.
That's correct, Your Honour.
Can you recall whether you gave any guidance to Constable Rolfe at that time about his failure to activate his body-worn video?
Look, I can't recall giving him any specific individual guidance in relation to the activation of his body-worn video. I know I had several conversations with Constable Rolfe, as well as the patrol group as a whole on several occasions. But the conversation specifically in relation to this, Your Honour, I don't recall.
Can I just clarify that I've understood you? Your evidence is that while you can remember having conversations with Constable Rolfe about the issue of body-worn video at different points in time, you can't remember if you had a conversation on this occasion. Is that right?
It's correct that I'm confident I had the conversation, but I do not remember the conversation, if that makes sense, Your Honour.
Sure.
So you're confident that following this incident on the 1st of April 2017, you provided remedial advice to Constable Rolfe?
I'm confident I did, Your Honour, yes. However, I do not have that documented anywhere.
And that's despite your evidence that you can't recall reviewing or auditing this use of force incident?
So clearly I did review the use of force. I wrote that. So initially, when several moments ago, I did not recall reviewing the use of force. However, having read the use of force and my report, it's clearly me that's written it. So yes, I definitely reviewed that use of force.
And what is it that makes you confident that you provided the remedial guidance? Certainly you say that body-worn video wasn't activated, but as I read it, the case note entry doesn't say remedial advice to be given or Gall to speak to Constable Rolfe. Is it an assumption?
You're correct. It doesn't say that. At that time, it was sorry, what was the date of this? 2017. I wouldn't say body-worn video was in its infancy. It had been used for a period of time. I can't recall for how long, but it was it was something that was continually on the agenda, and that was to make the members aware that they were activating their body-worn video. That's why I'm so confident that I would have spoken to Constable Rolfe about this. Is that it was always on the agenda, the use of body-worn video.
In fairness to you, there is definitely evidence that you did provide that remedial guidance to Constable Rolfe on a number of occasions, or at least there are notes that you provided that guidance. There are also notes that you provided guidance to the patrol group as a whole. So I'm not suggesting that didn't occur at some point in time. I suppose what I'm getting at is if we wanted to find some objective record of when remedial advice was given, where would we look?
There would not be any.
Okay. So that wouldn't end up on Constable Rolfe's My Career profile?
No.
I want to ask you some more some questions about body-worn video in a moment, but what I'll do is I'll turn to the next use of force incident you reviewed. Beck, could I have document 2, please? Senior Sergeant, this case note entry concerned the arrest of a Cleveland Walker on the 1st of April 2019. Can you recall auditing this use of force case note entry?
Yes, I can, Your Honour.
Just briefly, you can recall that Cleveland Walker was chased by Constable Rolfe and Sergeant Kirkby, correct?
Correct.
Constable Rolfe had activated his body-worn video but deactivated it during the pursuit.
That's correct.
His apprehension of Mr. Walker was not captured on the body-worn video.
Correct.
When Sergeant Kirkby arrived, Kirkby stated that he saw Constable Rolfe with his knee on Mr. Walker's back, ground stabilising him.
Yes, correct.
Mr. Walker had blood on his face and forehead.
Yes.
And during the apprehension and while being transported to the cage, Mr. Walker complained on the body-worn video that he had been assaulted by police. Can you recall that?
Yes, I can, Your Honour.
Specifically, while lying on the ground, he said, "I want to speak to my lawyer. You banged me against the rock."
Yes, I recall that, Your Honour.
Now, I just want to take you through this document. Perhaps, Beck, if we could go to page 4. Again, your name is at the top of the page. Take it from me that on the final page there's a subject heading that says supervisor details.
Yes.
And that's your name, Alistair Gore. Is this what's written in this part of the document under supervisor details comments? Was that put into the document by you?
Yes.
So these are your findings, in effect, of what had happened, whether the complaint was substantiated, so on and so forth.
It doesn't relate to a complaint, Your Honour. It relates to my assessment of the use of force.
Okay. But certainly you've accepted a moment ago that the body-worn video, I withdraw that. You reviewed the body-worn video?
Yes, Your Honour.
And you accept that on the body-worn video there was a complaint of an assault by Mr. Walker?
Yes, I do.
And he had injuries consistent with the mechanism of injury, which was that his head had been bashed into a rock. You'd agree?
Yes, I agree.
Now, the third paragraph reads, injuries. When arrested, Walker had an injury to his forehead. This had been sustained most likely when he went to ground when trying to evade arrest shortly before arrest or during the foot pursuit on Anzac Hill, when he may have fallen over due to rock, terrain and darkness. You can see that?
Yes.
That in effect is a finding that the injury was most likely to have occurred in a particular way, correct?
That is correct, yes.
And no reference is made in that passage or anywhere else in the comments you inputted to the complaint of assault that this individual had made, is there?
No, there's not, Your Honour.
And indeed, did you know at that time that Cleveland Walker went on to give a record of interview in which he said, consistently with his contemporaneous complaint, that the coppers just plant me and grab me by the hair and just bang, bang, bang against the rock, keep going. I just didn't get treated right at the time when I got arrested. Were you aware of that when you audited this use of force entry?
No, I wasn't, Your Honour.
Okay. How could you offer an opinion about what had happened in those circumstances? What basis was there to prefer the account of, I'm assuming, Constable Rolfe to the account of Cleveland Walker?
It was based on the account of the risk assessment provided by the officer.
I see. So when auditing a use of force case note entry, if a person who's been apprehended says that an officer assaulted them, but the officer says that they didn't, you assume that they were not assaulted?
No, look, upon considerable reflection, it is something that I should have taken into account, Your Honour, upon reviewing the use of force.
Indeed, you say the actions of Rolfe and Kirkby and the force used was minimal, justified, and necessary to prevent the escape of Walker. Do you agree that that was your conclusion?
Yes.
Assuming that Constable Rolfe had bashed Cleveland Walker's head into a rock, would that have been minimal, necessary and justified force?
No, Your Honour.
So in a sense, in order to audit this use of force case note entry, you assumed that nothing wrong had happened and then gave it the tick of approval.
Look, it does read that way. I understand Cleveland Walker was intoxicated as well at the time. That's something that I later learned. But in essence, look, I should have taken into account his commentary in relation to his allegations on the body-worn video.
In circumstances where you had directly conflicting accounts between Constable Rolfe and Cleveland Walker, and where there was evidence that Constable Rolfe had not just failed to activate his body-worn video, but had turned it off while pursuing Mr. Walker, do you think that this was a case note entry that needed to be escalated for review by a more senior officer?
Look, at the time, I didn't feel the need for that to happen. However, on reflection, it's possible that I should have escalated the matter.
This at the time, I know that hindsight is 2020, this at the time was a run-of-the-mill case note entry, correct?
It's something that I do, or a supervisor would do frequently. Perhaps most, or often most shifts, every other shift from different members.
And your approach to this case note entry would reflect your practice on most shifts?
Yes, that's correct.
Finally, your summary does note that the issue of turning the camera off and instead using covert mode is to be discussed with Rolfe. Now, understand that Detective Superintendent Lee Morgan asked you whether you could recall giving that remedial advice. Can you recall whether you did or whether someone else did?
Look, I don't recall if anybody else did. Again, I cannot recall the specific conversation. However, I did have a number of conversations with members, with Constable Rolfe and the patrol group as a whole, because it was such a topical matter. That's also not recorded anywhere where I did have the conversation with him.
So I take it you couldn't recall what you said to Constable Rolfe on this occasion if you did give the remedial advice?
I'm unable to recall that.
Are you aware that the Professional Standards Command ultimately found that Constable Rolfe's claim that he had deactivated the body-worn video to arrest Walker covertly was not credible?
No, Your Honour.
Okay. Would you, in your conversations with Constable Rolfe, have tested the credibility of his account of why he deactivated his body-worn video?
There would have been questions in relation to why he did that. Yes, Your Honour.
Okay. Questions you can't now recall?
Yes, correct.
And that aren't recorded anywhere?
Correct.
Okay. Now, were you aware that one of the reasons that the Cleveland Walker incident was recategorised for the purpose of disciplinary investigation was that it bore similarities to another allegation that had been made by another individual?
No, I wasn't aware of that, Your Honour.
Are you aware of the allegation that a Mr. Malcolm Ryder had made that in November 2018 Constable Rolfe had smashed his head into the ground?
No, I wasn't aware of that.
Have you since become aware of that incident?
Look, I've become aware of the name Malcolm Ryder due to my observations and following of this inquest, Your Honour. However, I have no, without being reminded, I have no recollection of that name or any incidents involving him.
Okay. Were you aware then, or have you since become aware that there are in fact at least 3 other use of force incidents in which, after applying false force or being involved in the application of force, arrest targets ended up with head injuries?
No.
Would it concern you to learn, cast your mind back to, let's say, October of 2019, would it concern you to learn that a junior officer under your command had been involved in at least 3 incidents in which, following an arrest by Constable Rolfe, the arrest target ended up with quite significant head injuries.
Yes, if I was aware of that, that is something that would flag with me, and it would certainly be of concern, yes.
Okay. But I take it that your evidence is that you really didn't have an awareness of these other use of force incidents.
That's correct, Your Honour.
You were only aware of the use of force incidents that you were auditing personally, is that correct?
Correct. As the watch commander, you don't, and you're probably already aware of this, however, when the shift sergeant used to audit the use of forces, if they were deemed to be appropriate, justified, necessary, etc., then they wouldn't come to my desk. I would not hear about those uses of force, Your Honour, unless I had heard about them on the radio or through other conversations, through debriefs, or from the custody sergeant, for example.
Were you making day-to-day decisions about how Constable Rolfe was deployed?
On occasions, I would, Your Honour, yes.
Do you think that it was important as the senior sergeant who oversaw Patrol Group 5 for most of Constable Rolfe's service in the Alice Springs police station, that you had a better degree of insight into his use of force incidents across the board?
If I had become aware, if it had flagged with me that the use of force being administered by Constable Rolfe was a concern at the time, then certainly that would, or that may reflect my decision making in terms of his taskings.
Okay. For example, it might affect your decision as to whether he was suitable for deployment with a tactical team like the ART.
Look, if I had grounds to believe or suspect that maybe he wasn't suitable for being a member of the IRT, then yes, that would be my responsibility to flag that with the management of the IRT, yes.
All right. Well, why don't we just... You certainly knew in January of 2020 that Constable Rolfe was very keen to seek out arrest targets, but also had a number of complaints of late.
That's correct, Your Honour.
And indeed, you told investigators on the 20th of January 2020, and this is at page 48, Your Honour, the 30th of January 2020, that from the last couple of years he'd had a couple of complaints in relation to excessive force. You were then asked the question, tell me about any effect that's had on how Zach Rolfe might be utilised, if any, and your response was, it hasn't.
That's correct, Your Honour.
You were then asked why not, and your answer was, because I have faith in Zach's work ethic and the way he operates, and I know him generally. He'll always get the job done. You know, some people you give a job to and it doesn't get done, but you give him a job and it gets done.
That's correct.
And that reflected your thinking at the time.
That's correct, Your Honour.
I want to ask you some questions about what you knew in November of 2019. You certainly knew that he'd had a number of complaints in relation to excessive use of force, is that correct?
That's correct.
You knew that he'd been consistently provided with remedial advice for failing to turn on his body-worn video, correct?
That is correct.
And you, in fact, had provided him with that advice on a number of occasions.
Correct.
Cleveland Walker is one example.
Yes.
But if I put it to you that we have a number of other promise records that conclude with to be provided remedial advice by Alistair Gore, would you accept that that's something that...
Yes, look, if you have that on record, then I would accept that, yes.
Okay. Now, I think you gave evidence that you were not a regular attendee at meetings of the CMT, correct?
That is correct, Your Honour.
Okay. Were you aware that issues relating to Constable Rolfe's use of force and his use of body-worn video were raised on one view at meetings of the CMT in July and October of 2019?
No, I'm not aware of that, Your Honour.
Okay. you gave some evidence that you were aware of the Malcolm Ryder matter. You'd become aware of it.
Yes.
Now, did you hear in May of 2019 that a sitting Northern Territory judge had said that Constable Rolfe had lied while giving evidence?
Now, this is something I have come to hear about in the last year. The date you mentioned was May 2019?
The transcript of His Honour's reasons is the 9th of May 2019.
So I'm not aware of that, or I wasn't aware of that at the time. That's something that I've only become aware of in the last year.
Okay. Have you since become aware that that same Northern Territory judge suggested that Constable Rolfe had fabricated evidence?
No, I'm not aware of that, Your Honour.
And are you now aware that Constable Rolfe was giving evidence defending an application of force or justifying the use of force against Malcolm?
No, I'm not aware of that.
Okay. Do you think that that's something that it was important that you, the senior officer who was making decisions about how Constable Rolfe was utilised, knew?
Yes, I do.
Do you think it was something that you needed to know in order to make decisions about whether or not Constable Rolfe was suitable, and by suitable I mean safe, for deployment with a tactical team like the IRT?
It would certainly have been helpful to know that, yes. However, if he hadn't been, if it was the case that he hadn't been deemed suitable for use in the IRT, I would suggest you could also argue that he wouldn't be deemed suitable for use as a general duties officer.
So in fact, your answer is that had you been aware of that, it might have been your view that Constable Rolfe was not suitable for deployment as a general duties police officer in the Northern Territory, at least pending the resolution of an investigation into...
It's possible, Your Honour, but I couldn't categorically say yes or no.
It's a pretty extraordinary allegation, isn't it? An allegation by a sitting judge that an officer had fabricated evidence justifying a use of force.
Your Honour,
Yes, it is, Your Honour.
I object to the form of the question. A number of questions have been put about the findings of Judge Borchers and consequent or subsequent investigations being conducted by PSC, and I wonder, out of fairness to the witness, whether Exhibit 16 should also be brought to his attention.
Your Honour, the purpose of this questioning is not to ask the officer to comment upon whether the investigation was ultimately substantiated or resolved in a particular way. What we do know is that the investigation was ongoing at the time of Constable Rolfe's deployment to Yuwindamu, and in fact that Crime Command was preparing a memorandum to the Department of Public Prosecutions seeking an advice in relation to a potential prosecution for the offence of perjury. What I'm asking is whether the systems that were in place at that time, on the information that was available at that time, were appropriate or operating effectively. Now, in fairness to the witness, I will point out that following an investigation, it was ultimately determined that there were insufficient prospects to charge Constable Rolfe with perjury. But the questions I'm asking are really directed at what was known at that point in time.
And if it had been known, what actions might have been available or should have at least been considered?
That's right.
Yes, all of that question.
I take it that you did not know that in the lead up to his deployment in November of 2019, that Crime Command was preparing a memorandum to the Director of Public Prosecutions seeking an advice in relation to an offence of perjury.
I did not know that, Your Honour.
That would be a very significant investigation, would it not?
Yes, it would.
in your view, irrespective of how it was ultimately resolved, is that a matter that could have affected your decision that Constable Rolfe was suitable for deployment in any capacity?
Possibly. There have been instances of members being under investigation for various matters, offences, that have been stood down, have been relieved of general duties. But it would, certainly, if I was aware of that, it certainly would have been a consideration at the time, Your Honour.
A consideration that you would have taken into account along with your knowledge at the time that there had been other complaints of excessive use of force, correct?
Correct.
And that you would have taken into account along with your knowledge that remedial advice had consistently been given regarding Constable Rolfe's failure to activate his body-worn footage.
Yes.
All right. Is the effect of the evidence you gave to investigators on the 30th of January 2020
Can I just,
that...
before you go on, and I take it you weren't aware that one of the issues in the Ryder matter was Constable Rolfe's failure to activate his body-worn video?
I wasn't aware of that, Your Honour.
And if you had been aware that there was another incident of failing to activate a body-worn video that was under investigation, is that a matter that you would have taken into account?
Taken into account into which decision, Your Honour?
In determining whether or not it was Constable Rolfe was suitable for deployment as general duties or any other role?
Yes, it is, Your Honour. That would have been a consideration.
A significant one.
Yes, perhaps.
Given
Yes.
a number of times you've spoken to him about that.
Yes.
Would it concern you to learn that no one seems to have sat down and considered all of the information that was then available that might have borne on the decision about whether Constable Rolfe was suitable for ongoing deployment as a general duties police officer?
Yes.
Were you aware that the IRT standard operating procedures provide that members of the IRT will, or as a matter of discretion may, become ineligible for deployment where they're being performance managed or where they're the subject of disciplinary investigations?
No, Your Honour. I had no awareness of the SOPs in relation to the IRT.
Certainly that contemplates that someone is meant to be considering these matters on an ongoing basis, doesn't it?
Yes.
Do you think that that's a pretty powerful argument for why senior sergeants should be involved in the CMT meetings so that they have a kind of more holistic awareness of how their constables are travelling?
Yes, I'd agree with that.
Are you aware that the Northern Territory Police Force conducts psychometric testing of new recruits?
Yes, Your Honour.
Were you ever made aware of Constable Rolfe's performance during that psychometric testing?
No, Your Honour.
You weren't aware then that Constable Rolfe was identified as someone who had an above average aggression score?
No.
Object to this question, Your Honour. What this witness's opinion is on the psychometric testing, which we've got
I don't think he's being asked for an opinion on the testing. I think it might be an additional factor that he's going to be asked whether or not that kind of information might be helpful in his position.
the extent to which that psychometric testing is helpful, because all we've got so far in the evidence we've read is some results from some line of questions which I haven't certainly seen, unless in the briefing I haven't seen them back. What possible relevance?
I guess we have to add an assumption, which may or may not be borne out by the evidence, I don't know. Assuming the psychometric testing has a level of validity.
Sure. But in
And
the,
that may or may not be borne out, I don't know.
but in the psychometric testing itself, which is attached to the statement of Sharma, it has a period of time in which that assessment is valid, and it's for a period of 12 months. What possible opinion this witness can offer, called in circumstances where we're now 2 years, 3 years on from Constable Rolf's acceptance into the police force, where I don't know how that psychometric testing works, with the exception of what we've got, questions that were asked that proffer that opinion, and how on earth, how to assist you.
Sure, if there's evidence that it is no longer a valid basis for the conclusion, if there's a time frame on it, you might
I can rephrase the question if it persists.
I will, Your Honour, the report attached to statement of such and Sharma.
In fairness, I concede that the cut-off was, I believe, February 2017, so that's a reasonable point, you're right. I can come at the question a different way, I can put it in an abstract way.
I think that is a reasonable point. If there's a limitation as to the validity, that's why I said at the beginning, if we assume there's some validity to it, then maybe it's relevant. But if you can't make that assumption, or you don't think it's going to be made out in that case,
Yes, thank you.
take that point.
Assuming that there was valid and current psychometric data about a recruit who became a police constable and was serving under your command, would you agree that that kind of information might be relevant when considering other information like their use of force history that suggests that they might not be suitable for deployment?
Well, if this is based on an assumption, and so it's going to whether or not at some point in time, if there's that evidence available and it's thought to be, or there's belief in its validity, whether that is the kind of information that sergeants or senior sergeants or supervisors should be aware of when they're supervising members. So it's more general.
Your Honour, I think I have created the problem by asking these questions in the context of a consideration that occurred in November 2019, so I accept my friend's point. But I anticipate that the evidence will be from those who are responsible for recruitment, that once the recruitment phase has completed, this material is never provided to those who supervise constables in their early years as police officers, and while the data is current.
So would that data on its face have been current as at April 2017?
No, Your Honour, I withdraw the question. Can I suggest to you that the approach that you took in your recorded statement on the 30th of January 2020 was that because you had faith in Zach's work ethic and his capacity to get the job done, you weren't concerned about his or the growing number of use of force complaints he was involved in?
Look, when I use that term, to get the job done, it related to Zach Rolf's reliability across a number of jobs, across a number of requests that I had of him. So I'd identified in Zach Rolf that he was intelligent, he was a good communicator, and if I ask Zach Rolf to do something, he would do it. Whilst managing a patrol group, either in the position of a shift sergeant or a watch commander, you identify who on your patrol group has certain skills. You become aware of the abilities and the limitations of the staff that we work with, and on occasions you may, or I may, assign a task to someone and it may not have been done satisfactorily, Your Honour. Yes, so the gist of those comments in my statement were, and I'll still remain, that he was reliable and he did of him what I asked and what I tasked.
When you use words like reliable, satisfactory, what you're saying is you told him to go arrest someone and he came back and the person was arrested. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Okay.
But it didn't just relate to tasks involving arresting people. It related to a number of different tasks where his skills were utilised, Your Honour.
And because he was a useful police officer, a skillful, useful and intelligent police officer, it didn't concern you that there are a growing number of use of force complaints. Is that right?
Look, I was aware of those use of force, or I was aware of a couple of use of force complaints. If, reflecting upon it now, if at the time of the deployment to Yuendamu, or for that matter, any occasion when I'm tasking him to a specific tasking, if I had been aware holistically of every single one of his use of forces where there may have been issues, yes, that may have impacted on my taskings of Zach Rolfe.
Your evidence is that you were aware of a number of excessive force complaints over the years prior to November 2019.
So one of them would have been the Cleveland Walker matter, Your Honour. I don't recall what the other one. I don't recall what the other one would have been when I provided that statement. But yes, I was aware of at least a couple. Yes.
It's possible that what you were saying was that you'd heard about these matters, but you didn't know the details. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes.
What steps did you take to find out?
I didn't take any steps, Your Honour.
Okay. Did you not want to know whether Zach Rolfe was developing a problematic reputation for use of force?
So if it had been flagged at CMT meetings, for example, or by other means, if it had been flagged that he was developing a, how did you describe it? If he was developing, if he was using a reputation, thank you. If he was developing a reputation of using excessive force, I would want to know about that. Yes, and that would impact how he was used.
But you weren't attending the CMT meetings where it might have been discussed?
Correct, Your Honour.
And you didn't take any other steps to find out?
Correct.
Okay. Detective Sergeant Barham gave the opinion following his... Detective Senior Sergeant Barham gave the opinion following his review of all of Constable Rolfe's use of force incidents that Rolfe demonstrates a tendency to want to, quote, get his man no matter what, and pays little or no regard to the consequences of his actions, which has resulted in quite severe and totally unnecessary injuries to subjects in some cases. Can you see the consistency between that conclusion about Constable Rolfe's use of force history and your faith that and your decision to keep deploying Constable Rolfe, notwithstanding the complaints of excessive force, because he always got the job done?
I can see the connection between those two, Your Honour, yes.
There's a connection in the sense that if you don't proactively address excessive uses of force and reward people who get the job done, they may very well think that it doesn't matter if they're a little bit rough, because the institution they work for rewards results.
There was no reward for his results, Your Honour. I think I know where you're coming from with the question. Yes, but there were certainly no rewards for his results.
Your respect, though, is a reward.
Yes, I would acknowledge that, yes.
And you would have commended him when he did a good job, correct?
Correct.
No further questions. I know, time.
Yes, we'll break for lunch and we'll come back at 5 to 2.
All stand. Coronial Court announcements temporarily adjourned.
Say why.